I always try to keep track of the main events and what's behind it, where it's going, and all that kind of stuff. And what the wars are for as well, as the world gets standardized under the one socialist system. And it is a socialist system. You really have to study. You cannot go into this area without studying Professor Carroll Quigley's books, Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment. You cannot study it and understand and put it into context without doing that. You have to realize that men did sit and plan a century and beyond of how the world would be run and had and integrated, and the kind of society they wanted to bring into being. They not only planned it, they had the money, the ability, and the political contacts. I hate even saying contacts, because they put the politicians in, because big bankers were in on it, you see. The Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is the British branch, the mother lodge, you might say, for the CFR, literally was formed with Lord Milner's group and the Cecil Rhodes Foundation. The Milner's group was comprised pretty well entirely of international bankers and their sons. So they planned this socialist society. Now, do you understand what socialism is? It's like communism. There's three versions according to the class that you were born into. At the bottom level, people think, well, social is a nice word. We're social creatures, and therefore socialism must mean it's for the ordinary people. It's good things for the ordinary people. And they don't know to go any further than that. Remember, the Fabian Society, another branch, a specialized branch, as I say, of this octopus, under the CFR and all the rest of it. The Fabian motto, its actual logo had a wolf in sheep's clothing, because they needed to use the masses to bring in their new order of things. They needed to use the laboring classes, and therefore they gave spokesmen to the laboring classes that would speak on their behalf and become the leaders. But of course, why is the wolf inside the sheep's clothing? Well, the wolf really wanted to bring in a planned society. And once again, you have to see the Soviet story, the movie, the Soviet story. You've got to see it. I'll show you too how they can keep all that stuff, all that reality, all that stuff they always knew in your countries from your knowledge for 60 odd years, 70 years. And then show you it at the right time, when no one cares. But that's socialism in action. Remember, communism is a socialist doctrine. And they wanted to bring in a controlled society, planned population, where each country would have just the right amount of people born to serve the system. And it's a world of service they were going to bring in. And eventually, by using money, they would bring it in, and then by substituting money for credits issued by the government, they could keep control over you, and eventually you wouldn't even need the credits. That's what they believed. You could literally be born and be conditioned to be happy to serve the state, the world state. You'll see George Bernard Shaw on the Soviet story saying that all of you will have to come to us to justify why we should keep you alive. See, no one would be unemployed in your system. That is true. Mind you, a lot of folk wouldn't get born either, because they wouldn't need what they would call the excess to serve their purposes. It's a ruthless organization. But they always use the bottom classes, the disaffected groups, the fringe groups, to bring them into power. And then they come out with the iron fist. And that's where we are today, with the iron fist. Mind you, that we're distracted by all the stuff that's going on all over the world and daily events. I mentioned about how the European Union was the first amalgamation they were going to have. And remember that Karl Marx talked about this too in the 1800s. The exact same thing. So obviously the Royal Institute for International Affairs was not a first-time organization. It came from a pre-existing organization. And Marxism was one of them. They said that they'd bring in a North American Union after the European Union. There'd also be other unions, but mainly a Far Eastern group. possibly even under the control of China. Long before China ever got any factories up on the go. So everything is long-term planning, long-range planning. So the North American Union, I've mentioned before, they did the first public signing, not the first signing, but the first public signing in 2005. And I'm going to put some links up on my website, cuttingthroughthematrix.com tonight, for you to look at yourself. And for those that have forgotten all about it, to go back and remember. And the first one is just a simple Google search called Building a North American Community. That was the title of the Council on Foreign Relations agenda, which they presented to Congress and to the Canadian Parliament and the Mexican Parliament, and the three leaders of the countries signed it, the first part in 2005. They said the final one would be done, one every year, but the final one in 2010. That was their target initially for total integration. The CFR came out in Canadian television when the signing was done, the first in 2005. The Global Television and CBC broadcast it. And a couple of reporters stood up in the audience at the time and said, is this to be a duplicate of the European Union with its own parliament and all the rest of it? And of course they fudged and hedged about that, but that is the intention of it. Now, there's an article here that came out from Raw Story initially, and then Blacklisted News have it in their website too, but it's from Raw Story. It says, a prolific Mexican politician and intellectual, George Castaneda, believes that a greater North American community, a North American Union with economies tied together under a European Union-style system, complete with open borders and a unified currency, is the wave of the future. Now, this is a top CFR member too, remember. And this is from the 17th of February, 2010. In a new interview with website bigthink.com, Castaneda's Mexico's foreign minister from 2000 to 2003 and a global distinguished professor of politics at New York University said that with nearly 11% of Mexicans living in the United States, he has stopped seeing his nation as a Latin American country. Well, my sense is that we're moving closer and closer to forms of economic integration with the United States and Canada, and conceivably Central America and the Caribbean could become part of that in coming years. Well, he knows that because, you see, when they did the free trade negotiations back in the 80s into the early 90s, and I have documents from that and from the newspapers, they discussed that then. And that's why from the Caribbean, in fact, they didn't need passports to come into Canada, etc. They were already grouped under this new union. So they were already putting heads back in the 80s, for those who didn't know. But he says, I don't see Mexico as a Latin American country. Too much of trade, investment, tourism, immigration, remittances, absolutely everything is concentrated exclusively with the United States. So Mexico has to be part of a North American community, a North American Union, which at some point probably should include some type of monetary union along European lines with a free flow of labor, with energy being on the table, etc. And I'll be back with more on this union that most of you don't realize is already happening after this break. Hi folks, this is Alan Watt and we're cutting through the matrix, keeping our eyes on the targets, because when you're deluged with info and data, you've got to re-understand the agenda that doesn't break up and get forgotten for years. It carries on regardless. And you'll find so many, well, almost all the big journalists, the big TV presentators, all these people are members of the Council on Foreign Relations who drafted up the agreements. And they admitted that on the Canadian television. The CFR drafted up these gradual integrated agreements for the governments, and they did sign them into law, by the way. Every year they do it. This year is the last year for the last one to be signed, and that's still to come. It says, often demonized as some type of conspiracy theory in mainstream American press, the so-called North American Union proposals have actually existed for some time. In May of 2005, the Council on Foreign Relations released a document entitled Building a North American Community, in which it calls for an economic union-like integration, a more European type, of Canada, the US, and Mexico. While the document does not specifically call for the ceding of sovereignty between the three nations, and they never did with the Union either till it was done, as some vocal opponents of the idea have suggested, it does recommend the formation of a North American Advisory Council and a multinational inter-parliamentary group to facilitate mutual cooperation. I'll stop there and go back to the free trade negotiations, because when they were doing them, with Brian Mulroney and so on involved in it for Canada, it turned, they actually said in Maclean's magazine at the time that Mr. Salinas, who was the president of Mexico at the time, was the man for the job to be the head of the North American Advisory Council, which they said at the time was a sort of embryonic parliamentary system like the Economic Union.